Our focus is on personal empowerment, a commitment to well-being, and the motivation to achieve more than you ever thought possible. And we have another outstanding guest this week. Dr. Saqib Qureshi is the author of Being Muslim Today, Reclaiming the Faith from Orthodoxy and Islamophobia. Dr. Qureshi lives in Toronto. He's a fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he received his PhD in International Relations and Epistemology. His work has been featured in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Entrepreneur. Qureshi has produced 2 films, and in 1996, the BBC One documentary, Dawaah, the first television documentary about the Muslim community in any Western country. His previous books include The Broken Contract and Reconstructing Strategy. Saqib Qureshi, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. Thank you.
So I have to ask you before we start, I was hyping up the music for the intro. Did you live up to expectations?
Yeah, no, I had a good jiggle over here. I exercised the knees a little bit. That was good fun.
Perfect. Sometimes our guests like to dance, and so I always put that out there for folks if they want to. So no pressure on that.
So, maybe off camera.
There you go. Fair enough. Fair enough. So there's so much about the history of Islam that people just don't understand. Let's start with the basics. Who was the Prophet Muhammad, and what role did he play in the founding of Islam?
So the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims consider him to be the last of God's prophets, and his role is really around crystallizing the final stage of the faith, a faith which begins with Adam, goes to Abraham, and trickles down eventually to the last prophet, who passed away in the year 632. And so he had the foundational role, really. He is the foundational role in the final journey of the creed of worshiping one God.
And what else should people of other faiths, or perhaps non-believers of any faith, understand about the origins of Islam and its early history?
The origins of Islam really, it's kind of begins, I think, in the 7th century. Mid 7th century, late 7th century, the religion begins to form. It's crystallized over 400-500 years in much the same way that many other religions didn't just start on day one and continued as is in their entirety for the next X number of centuries. So Islam, in that sense, is not any different. The vast bulk of the faith was really assembled 200-300 years after the last prophet's passing away. And so what we have today is a very broad spectrum, which is called Islam. It's not like a linear point or a linear line or a single point, but it's a very broad spectrum. And that's taken hundreds and hundreds of years of contradictory and conflicting opinions from all sorts of people. It's as you might expect, it's been a messy journey to get to the point that we're at right now.
Understood. What is the Quran, and how is it regarded within the Islamic faith?
So the Quran is a very interesting document. It's not like the Bible or the New Testament. The Quran is, and I'll be very pedantic, so it's important that the words are chosen wisely in this particular answer. The Quran is an assembly of transcribed messages which the last prophet revealed via an angel from God during the course of his 23 years of prophethood. So it's a compilation of messages. Those messages were transcribed after they were received, and 10, 15, 20 years after the last prophet's passing away, they were put together in a book, and that book came to later be known as the Quran. And since then, it's become a phenomenally, well, not immediately, but certainly by the late 7th century, it took on a real resonance in the Muslim community as the centerpiece of the faith. One caveat that I often draw attention to is that each of those messages, like any non-written message, comes with its context, not only of who heard the message after the last prophet received it, what happened in the hour before the message, where were they geographically, what were the cultural, social, political issues or tensions that the message spoke to. The tone of a message obviously becomes very important as well. And so all of that is never captured in a transcription. And I've caveated this in my book that, look, we might have the transcribed messages, but at least let's recognize that transcription is not the perfect medium to convey language. It's, an oral message is delivered in its moment and its context is so important, whereas the written message actually has a very different context to it.
And as a follow-up to that, what are the 5 pillars of Islam and why are they central to the faith?
So the 5 pillars are bits and pieces that were assembled after the last prophet passing away. There were originally 4, and we had the 5th and the 5 pillars. The anchor is overwhelmingly the worship of one God, a God that has no partners, no sisters, no brothers, no friends, an absolute infinite entity, and the unmitigated worship of the one God, no son of, no whatever, So that is the anchor pillar of the Islamic faith, and that is, I think, is probably the one thing that unites every single Muslim sect in the history of the religion. It's that commitment to undiluted monotheism in its absolute form. And then you've got 4 other pillars, and those focus really around charity giving, which is known as zakat. Then you have the annual pilgrimage to Hajj, which each person must do once in their lifetime, though the event takes place once every lunar year. And then you've got fasting during Ramadan, which is for 30 days. And that becomes very, very important as well. But I think the point that is worth stressing about the pillars, that they are not that they were put together over a period of time. The 5th pillar, by the way, is the prayer, to that one Lord on a regular basis.
And what parallels would you draw between the 5 pillars and some of the core beliefs of Christianity or other faiths? And by that, I mean, for instance, the practice of almsgiving seems very similar to the practice of tithing.
Right. I think the similarities between the 5 pillars and the other faiths. So Judaism, at least in the last couple of millennia, has been a very monotheistic faith. It didn't quite start that way, but it has become a very monotheistic faith. And I think there's a massive overlap between Islam's commitment to the worship of one God and one God alone, and monotheism. Charity giving is very, very important to Islam. And I don't just pay lip service to it, because what I will say is that the Quran, messages of the Quran resonate again and again and again with an obligation to be charitable to everybody. And there kind of no ifs or buts to that premise. It's like, it just features as one of the central features of the faith. And I suppose, I don't think the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, and particularly around the Kaaba and the other important sites, I'm not quite sure of an equivalence in Catholicism or Protestantism. I don't think there is one, in fact. And prayer emphasis is something that I think is strongly distinguished within the Islamic faith, because it comes up again and again in the Quran, the importance of praying to God and remembering to pray to God. So, but I do think that the biggest overlap that I see is the fact that you've got the centerpiece of the Islamic faith, which is a fierce commitment, an absolute commitment to monotheism, and Judaism's maintained that for the last couple of thousand years. That to me is the big overlap, in fact.
And how do Muslims view God, and what are the key attributes of God in Islam?
Oh my goodness me, that is a loaded question if ever there was one. So, what are the attributes of God? Well, so I'm going to just say that here's a classic case of the diversity and heterogeneity of Islam, that there is no such thing as what are the attributes of God. You do have a list that has been compiled of some of the characteristics of God, and there are 99 names, the merciful perhaps being the number 1, and beneficent being like the two most that are associated with God are the beneficent and the merciful. So that's something that we see again and again. But within the spectrum of Islam, within its 1400 years, it's unfair to say that there has been a single dominant interpretation of or characteristic of God, beyond recognizing that in the Quran, his title as the beneficent and the merciful come up again and again and again and again. It's like another one, which is perhaps also quite prominent, is the master of the day of judgment. Not the master with a couple of advisors, and not the master with, some human beings giving their own 5 cents worth. No, the master of the day of judgment. And so that's really the core set that I can think of. But really, what I will say is that to view Islam as a single ideology is a phenomenal mistake. Like, no scholar worth half their salt is ever going to let anybody get away with this notion that Islam is a single ideology and has been so for 1400 years. It's not today, it wasn't 1,000 years ago, and it certainly wasn't during the formation of its faith either.
So I guess for those who are not scholars, how would you educate them or make them aware that it's not this one, to your point, singular thing or singular faith? How can we educate in today's world, given that we've got the internet, you've got there's a computer in your pocket all the time, in terms of translating that message in terms of being Islamic is not just one specific thing?
Yeah, I think there are a few good authors out there who've done an awfully good job in putting together summaries of Islam. I'm not going to comment on my own book, but the likes of Raza Aslan come to mind as just one of many people who've put together some really interesting, good, comprehensive perspectives of Islam, or reasonably comprehensive, I think. But this notion of the Islamic viewpoint, or the Islamic interpretation of, or Islam says X, Y, and Z, I think there's an awful lot of that which is just mumbo jumbo. The caveat that I issue there is fundamentally around monotheism. Like, during the 1400 years of this faith, there has been no theological exception to that. It's been undiluted, raw, very, very, very firm monotheistic faith. We don't pray to any human being. We don't pray to Muhammad or Jesus or Moses or Abraham. We don't pray to a black cube, though we do pray in the direction of. And I know that the argument can easily be made that culturally, not theologically, but culturally, many Muslims may go maybe a bit blurry of those defining lines. So do some Muslims culturally end up praying at the Kaaba itself, or do they worship the last prophet? Theologically, no. Culturally, there's a bit of a debate as to whether their reverence for those icons extends a bit too far.
You mentioned mumbo jumbo. Is that a technical or an academic phrase?
No, that's somewhere not quite within the world of academia, but we'll try and shove it in the postmodern world.
And I appreciate you not wanting to talk about your book. However, for those who do want to read it, where can they find your book?
Chris, so my book is available at all major bookstores, independent bookstores, and all your classic .com, .ca, .co.uk websites as well for books. So it's out there. Yes, done quite well.
And again, title is Being Muslim Today, Reclaiming the Faith from Orthodoxy and Islamophobia. So I always like to give the plug for the guests, and so don't worry about it. It's a shameless solicitation, so don't be bashful about it. It's what we're here for. All right, so back to less mumbo jumbo. What is the hadith and what is its significance?
So the hadith originally hadith really comes from the word around narrations of or sayings of. And originally, when the faith got going in the 7th century, the hadith were the sayings of anybody who was important who had gravitas. And over time, over 300-400 years, the hadith took on a real prominence as exclusively being the sayings of the last Prophet Muhammad. And really, by the 10th century onwards, there is a real commitment to treating hadith as incredibly important in the faith. And to some extent, some people would have argued even back then that it's as important as the Quran, which is a compilation of messages received by Muhammad from God. So hadith have become a very important point of sources within the Islamic faith. Today, it's very hard to have a conversation about Islam without a conversation about hadith. And there's a massive debate and controversy around their role, because some people have argued that we don't need the hadith that were kind of crystallized and given a stamp of authenticity in the 10th and 11th centuries. We don't really need them because the religion was completed to us in the year 632. And others would argue, no, that same religion that was completed in 632 makes inferences to what we now might consider hadith, and so therefore we do have to observe them. It's a massive compendium of supposed statements that the last prophet made. Sometimes there's a context, a very, very limited context, which is elucidated. In most cases, there's no context. Some hadith, or a very small number of hadith, are not just the sayings, but they're the actual actions of the last prophet as well. But that does kind of, we could enter into a very interesting conversation about the practices of the prophets versus the sayings of the last prophet.
Hopefully we'll get to that. The Bible is contradictory in its teachings, and particularly when it comes to the Old Testament. There's, the old an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and the New Testament, in which Jesus turns the other cheek and tells his followers to do the same. It is consistent in both testaments, though, about admonitions to love one another. How does Islam address those same sort of issues of justice, compassion, and loving one another?
So, how does Islam engage? I think the first answer I give really is around God's manifestations, or the attributes of God that we've understood. So at one end, merciful, at the other end, day of judgment. And day of judgment assumes, by definition, that you could be punished, which then raises questions around mercy. And that's an entire theological conversation that is hard for, I would argue it's very hard for a limited mind human to get on top of, which might be a cop-out as far as an atheist is concerned. But I think, I do turn around and I say, look, I'm not entirely sure that mankind or humankind is in a particularly strong position to empathize or understand God. So there's a headline there. Another very powerful angle that I wish to draw upon is that Islam has a very, very strong anti-violence theme to it, which is such an ironic thing in the modern era, okay, in the post 1970s era, where the Islamic brand has been deeply associated with violence. But prior to 1970s, overwhelmingly, the brand was not linked to violence, and more importantly, the theology certainly isn't. And like I've mentioned many times, there are no Muslim fingerprints to the world's worst genocides. And as much as my non-Muslim friends would want to avoid, but Protestantism is to be found all over the Nazi creed. And the genocide in Congo didn't have any Muslim fingerprints. The genocide in North America, albeit slow motion, that didn't have any Muslim fingerprints to it either. So yes, there has been at least the most obvious one, Turkey and Armenia, which is the big standout exception. But fundamentally, if you look at the largest genocides in human history, there are no Muslim fingerprints. And so I do find it ironic that my faith has been kind of lumped up with a brand that is unjustified, because the theology of the faith is not only overwhelmingly anti-violent, but it's incredibly pluralistic, to the point that it's kind of jaw-dropping. So to elucidate that, in the 7th century, you've got this gentleman, Muhammad, turns up, produces, he doesn't produce the book, but he receives messages. And one of the messages that comes off, and it's actually in the Quran, is a message from God instructing the last prophet to not push his religion onto other people, but to compete in doing good with people of other faiths. you know, and the emphasis on not compelling other people to convert, and your job is just to give the message, and if they don't want to convert, that's up to them. And I find that incredibly refreshing, because if I look at any other, like if I look at Judaism and Christianity, I mean, you don't have to look very far into the New and Old Testament to see some quite massively aggressive diktats and stories, and like, wow, I mean, how is it that the Old Testament talks about killing babies? It's like, well, I don't know. Whereas in the Quran, again and again, we're told the messages that come out are, look, violence is a bad thing, and when somebody else stops being violent to you, you have to stop. You just can't continue. And I'm not saying that every single Muslim in the history of the religion, 1400 years, including the 2 billion people around today, abide by every single atomic layer of that message. But if that's the theology, I mean, that's something to be damn proud of. I mean, my 3 boys, teenagers, have slowly learned to unhook themselves from the mass media marketing campaign, which goes out in North America and the UK, linking Islam to violence and nutcases and loonies. I've reminded them again and again, look at the theology of the texts, sorry, of the faith. Look at the texts themselves. It's repeated same messages. You don't push your religion on anybody. You give the message, that's the end of, that is it. You compete for good deeds alongside other religions, okay? When it comes to violence, the moment somebody else stops being violent to you, you have to stop. You just can't continue. There's no overkill. There's no, he hit me first, okay, and you defend yourself, and you can't go around hitting them again. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way.
So I'm going to go off script here a little bit, if that's okay. And if this gets too controversial, personal, please tell me I'm not going to push it. You talked about your boys there. You talked about your boys and talked about them unplugging from social media, which is obviously extremely difficult in today's world. I've got a 21-year-old daughter, an 18-year-old daughter, and a 12-year-old son. And so I feel your pain and your misery. But my listeners and viewers know that I was at ground zero on 9/11 and saw everything literally across the street from that. And obviously there was a huge, I'll call it an uproar, anti-Islam, things of that nature after the attacks, for the terrorist attacks. A few months later, I was on a business trip from New York to Chicago. And I was in a sport coat and pants, I think, no tie. And we're in line going through security. And there was a young Islamic family in front of me dressed in their attire, the burqa, young son who was probably 4 or 5. And either TSA or Homeland Security or one or both asked them to step aside so that they could be frisked.
Randomly screened.
Exactly. And that's my point. And so obviously the family was very upset, very distraught, as they should be. And I was literally the next person in line. And for those of you who are listening right now, I'm a 6'3" white male, 220 pounds. And so they didn't randomly select me. But when that family made an issue about it, they then asked me to step out. And I said, of course, I'll step out. And I understood exactly what was happening. Your book is about being Islamic today. You've got your boys, you've got you, your family, your faith. What is that like? Because it's sort of like, I guess, being African-American in the 60s, it was a completely different mindset in terms of how they were treated. You mentioned the genocide in North America. So those are the indigenous people, the Native Americans that have been, crucified, if you will, for lack of a better word, for centuries now. In your own personal view, kind of what's it like growing up that way? And then what are you doing besides unplugging from social media for your boys to say that's not how we are perceived and that's not who we are? And I just threw a lot at you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. Look, I think growing up as a Muslim in London in the 80s and 90s was not as problematic as the post 9/11 universe. So I have been randomly selected for interviews till the cows come home, to the point that there was a time where you kind of just expected it every time you entered the US. And so there is that piece. There is that discrimination. That discrimination was given a lot of fuel. Sorry, the ignition was really Bin Laden and the attacks, and the fuel came from the right-wing media. And it also came from a lot of people, a lot of Zionists who wanted to malign the indigenous Palestinian right for human rights and self-determination. They used Islamophobia. They backed a lot of Islamophobes so that any Muslim voice was discredited, full stop. And so we've been through the heavy hitting of that, and we've emerged. And I think the Muslim community of America and Canada and the US, these are communities that I'm aware of, that I'm integrated into some shape or form or another. And they have learned some very, very brutal lessons about the universe that they exist in and the level of discrimination. Having said that, there's also been a realization in this community, in these communities, that they are not just Muslims in America, but they are of America. So a point that's often made to me is that Muslims have been in the US since before the US even existed. Muslims have been in the UK since Shakespeare's time. Many of the most important buildings in London, St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, owe their architectural design and spirit to buildings in the Muslim world, particularly mosques. Like the minaret was copied and pasted and became the clock tower. The domes that you see in many of the fantastic Gothic cathedrals and late Gothic cathedrals come straight from the Muslim world. And so we've kind of gone back, reflected on reality, and said, actually, we belong here. Not just our architecture and our people, but our ideas belong here. You know, it's inconceivable to view the Renaissance in Western Europe as having had nothing to do with Islamic thinking. You know, the transport of ideas was just, the traffic, free-flowing traffic both ways was just immense. Like Europe influenced Islam, Islam influenced Europe, and the two are now increasingly, from a intellectual point of view, hard to break apart. And so that's a message that I've really shared with my kids, because they grew up in an environment where it's not unusual to be teased as a terrorist in the school playground, and that's not nice. And it's especially not nice when you can keep in mind that the theology of our faith is what it is. Number one. Number two, to be linked to a nutcase out in the caves of Afghanistan or Saudi, wherever he was hanging out, is a bit like linking, the average Protestant in the United States to Hitler. And let's face it, I mean, I made a mountain out of it, and I think it's the right thing to do. That for 12 years, Adolf Hitler ran a campaign where it was Protestant, but what he was doing, as far as he was concerned, was cloaked and imbued and backed by the Protestant church. And we don't pin that down on every single U.S. president pre-John Kennedy, who was the first Catholic president, I believe, or subsequent U.S. presidents and all the other American Protestants. We don't just do it. So we got lumped with that with Bin Laden, and there was an agenda behind that. And I think American Muslims and British Muslims have learned a bit about that agenda. We've learned that Zionism, will fuel Islamophobia. It's been doing that for decades now, and there's an angle to it, because you will not find a Zionist who believes that Palestinians should not be forcibly removed or should not have been forcibly removed. And so it's an unfortunate reality that we're dealing with, that you've got these political pressures to do with the conflict in Palestine and Israel impacting hundreds of millions of innocent people, just as a means to ethnically cleanse Palestine from homes that they've been in for generations. And we're kind of caught up in that mess, and I think just making my kids aware of what's going on around them. It hasn't been so much a blocking out of social media, but it's been an educational few years where I've had to remind them about who owns the media, what are they trying to do, who's pushing the money in the media, what is that money asking to be done, and just recognizing the reality, particularly out of Western media, U.S. media, CNN, Fox News, and how they're manipulated.
I appreciate you getting personal on that. And I know it was sort of off topic and off script. And like I said, there's no gotcha questions here. I try not to anyway, like I told you before the show. But if I could go a little bit further, one thing I pride in this show is we're focused on resiliency and empowerment. And that's what you're teaching and instilling in your boys, in your family, in your faith, in your friends. You mentioned before about being bullied as a terrorist, your kids, your boys on the playground, and how that's stereotypical, which unfortunately is correct. In reality, if you think about terrorists in general, most of them are white guys like me. You think about who just tried to take out, candidate, now President-elect Donald Trump. It's people like that have these ideas. I live about 20 miles from Sandy Hook, which exactly, almost, my daughter's 18, so it'll be about 12 years ago this December, a young teenage boy who had some mental health issues went in and massacred in the school. And so to me, that's a terrorist, whether they're mental health issues or not, white 19-year-old male. We talk about education. Mm-hmm. The U.S. education system, they're always changing in terms of what are in the history books. What are we going to teach our kids? What do we want to brainwash them with or not brainwash them with? Have they removed Hitler? Have they put Hitler in a banister? One thing, Pew Research about a year or so ago, the Gen Zers, so I think that's between like 20 to 30 right now, 1 in 5 view Osama bin Laden favorably. Exactly. Eye-popping, jaw-dropping, right? So put that aside. And this is Pew Research. This isn't some...
1 in 5.
1 in 5, 20% are sympathetic to Osama bin Laden. How can you and I, people of different faith, religions, countries, citizenship, get the message out there to say we're one civilization? It doesn't matter what race, creed, color, gender you are. We are one civilization on this planet. And how can we educate each other we're never going to eliminate hate, but to reduce that, the stereotypes that you mentioned before, because I'm a lifelong learner. And so, folks like yourself who are academics, I can't imagine what it took for you to write the book being Muslim today, and really comprehending in terms of like what it's really like. Because like I said, I was in line at LaGuardia Airport going to Chicago, and I didn't think about it. And the family in front of me, to your point, was pulled out.
Look, I think Chris, the US has a fairly distinct problem, and I don't think it's a problem which is shared by most of the Western world. You go to any capital city, the embassy that's most guarded, and it often looks like a demilitarized zone around it, is the US embassy. London, Paris. I mean, forget parts of Asia and Africa, because in those countries, you can't even get close to the US embassy without having to go through a tier of security checks. And so the question that I've asked a lot of friends of mine in the US is, why is it that your embassy is the one that's always literally, got tanks parked outside of it practically? And I think the underlying reason for that is the disconnection between America's professed ideals and its foreign policy, which is not particularly known to the vast majority of people. Like right now, here's the state of play in Palestine, just to elucidate that point. Now, right now, you have an Israeli prime minister who has been charged with war crime by the International Criminal Court. That International Criminal Court, as it happens, was also advised to do so by a former Israeli ambassador, who's one of the most senior judges when it comes to war crimes. So, and he's a Jewish, and he's a Holocaust survivor. He was part of the committee that said, yes, we should be charging Netanyahu with war crimes. Now, you have a prime minister charged with war crimes, potential genocide. Prima facie, almost every academic in this space is saying, yeah, prima facie, this is genocide. Let's go through the process, but prima facie is genocide. The US's role has not been to hold back that or stop supplying weapons or enforcing sanctions or using military force against the genocide, but it's actually been proactively supplying and sending military personnel to fight in the cause of the genocide. Now, with that reality, it becomes very, very, very hard for large parts of the world to ignore what US foreign policy is doing today and has done in many parts of the world over the course of many, many decades. Iran had a democratically elected prime minister, Mossadegh, a couple of generations ago, but he was overthrown with the assistance of the CIA. Not quite by the CIA, but certainly with the proactive assistance. And the US has backed one dictator, whether monarchical or military, in Muslim-majority countries till the cows come home. And so the US brand in many parts of the world is very negative. And I'm just trying to link into the point that you made about bin Laden, which is that I can think of a fair few number of people who've written stuff which essentially is along the lines of, we hate bin Laden, we think he's a bit of an idiot, we don't know the first thing about religion, but we do like the fact that he gave these American bullies a bloody nose. Which might seem contradictory, I can understand that. And it's a shame that we've got to that point. I can't but feel sorry for many of my friends in the US, and I travel to the US very frequently and have very, very close friendships with people out there, and I just can't feel a bit sorry, because they profess certain ideals around human rights, around freedom of speech, around the life, the right to pursue happiness, which is fantastic. And these are ideals which are shared globally, with caveats. They're shared globally, but minor twists in here, minor bits and pieces. But the way U.S. foreign policy is enacted in Africa, Asia, South America, again and again and again, it's done in a way which, if it surfaced, would be deeply embarrassing for the vast majority of Americans. And I think until we get to the bottom of the disconnection between the America that is talked about and the America that very often is, the United States will remain in a precarious situation. And I think what's interesting is that the British embassies in most parts of the world are nowhere near as guarded. Nowhere near as guarded. There's no real massive threat felt, as compared to the American counterparts. And that's a lesson for everybody, I think, to kind of think about. Say, why is it that it's only the US that is the country that seems to be unpopular, whereas our ideals, democracy, wanting freedom of speech, wanting the right to pursue happiness and to due process and courts, that is embraced, that's loved. That's really loved. People, in Iran, a lot of people are crying out for that. They're saying, we want the right to express ourselves. We want the freedom of speech. But, those Americans operating in the Gulf and the Middle East and what they're doing in Palestine, disgusting. That to me is a big conversation, which I don't think is going to happen in the US, but I think is one that is central to reconciling America's role in the world and also its relationship with the Muslim world, because I think that is more problematic than, let's say, British, French, German, Canadian relationships with the Muslim world.
I'm way off topic on this today, but this is a fascinating conversation to me. You mentioned how a few folks who have written about bin Laden giving the U.S. a bloody nose. You talked about the U.S. embassies being the most guarded around the world. But do you feel they're the most guarded because we're the most attacked? You've got the USS Cole, you've got various embassies. Is it because we're just pushing our ideals on the world, or is it just because I don't know what?
No, America's military presence is global. It's everywhere. And its interference in foreign countries is everywhere, and is often backing exactly those countries and governments and polities which are doing things which fly flat in the face of what Americans profess as their ideals. Genocide is not a stated American ideal. It is not. It might have happened, and there are people who will be very embarrassed by it, but it's not an American ideal. So funding, protecting, and to some extent sending military troops for a genocide is not about American ideals. This is, really, I think what you have is the fact that you've got American ideals, but you've also got this complete dissonance about we'll just completely ignore them. We believe in people, right for national self-determination. Well, except when the Palestinians want their country. We're not quite in it there. It's like, or we believe in free and fair elections. Well, unless Pakistan or Saudi, are pro-Western partners, unless it affects them. Well, all of these caveats, at the end of the day, the people on the ground are going to feel them, because they're going to say, well, why can't we have our own government in our country, in Pakistan? Why can't we have free elections? Well, you can't, because the Americans are funding the dictators. They're paying out the senior generals large sums of money, and they're funding the military, and they're keeping the economy up. And without their say-so, we can't have our own freedom of speech. We can't have our elected government, There is in Pakistan right now a very widespread belief that the country's cleanest politician, cleanest major politician, and certainly the most popular politician in the country is behind bars because the Americans want him there. That is widely accepted. It's widely accepted that without the American nod, the military would not have locked away Imran Khan for the most ridiculous criminal charges. And so, what am I saying? In essence, I'm saying it would be nice. It'd be really nice if the ideals that the American people professed to have were actually taken seriously when it came to stuff outside of their borders. You could even turn around and say it'd be nice if they did it inside their borders as well. But the disconnection with outside their borders is so profound that I find it amazing that Americans generally don't realize why it is that their embassies are typically the most guarded places in any capital city in the world. Actually, I'm going to go a step further. In some capital cities in the world, the Prime Minister's residence and palace is less guarded than is the American embassy. I have seen rulers of countries walk around without any security detail. But I just can't see the US ambassador doing that in the same country.
You talk about how we infiltrate and, the CIA or whoever it may be, special ops, kind of make things happen the way the US wants them to happen. I'm not going to name the network because they're not a sponsor of the show, but my wife and I are binge watching a show called Lioness. And it is exactly like you're scripting for Hollywood right now. So it's sad but true. America loves a champion. We like to take out the bad guy, that sort of thing. And so that's what it is geared towards. But I completely understand and agree with what you're saying there. You've written 3 books. You've got 2 documentaries. You and I seem to see eye to eye on 99% of what we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
If you and I were to write a book to help reshape world culture and how people would view religion generically, what would you think about that? A, would you do it with me? I'm finishing my 2nd book, but they're much lighter than yours. Well, in terms of being a co-author with somebody with a different religious background, I'm Presbyterian. My wife's Catholic, so you've got that sort of thing, and sort of just teaching worldviews in terms of how to be a good person, how to be charitable, how to be nice to your neighbor. We've got the American Thanksgiving coming up on Thursday, and we have this open door policy where if somebody has no place to go, my door is open, come on in, and there's plenty of wine and turkey. So, grab a chair and sit down. What are your thoughts in terms of like having that, I'm not going to say mind altering or world changing book, but really opening people's eyes and getting their perspective on how things are perceived and how things actually are?
It would be wonderful if religion could focus a bit more time and energy on helping people to be nice. Because it does a pretty bad job of it, I think. Way too interested in the pettiness of rituals and God knows what else, but not a lot of interest in just being nice. And there's a lot to be said for what you've just pointed out. As it happens, my oldest friend, somebody I've known almost my entire life, is a rabbi in London, and we are doing something exploring something quite similar with respect to interfacing ideas and communities and getting conversations going. But to your specific point about writing a book together, yes, I mean, in principle, I would be very willing to work with somebody on pushing out a book which focus a little bit on exchanging perspectives, like just making people understand, look, it's not as black and white and simplistic as a lot of the very, very crude base media has had you believe. I mean, it's just not. There needs to be an exchange of ideas and discussions and a realization that we're all human and we all have, it's from that human identity that we have value, not from our religious identity. We're not more or less important because we're Jewish or Christian or Sikh, but we are equally important because we only have value as human beings, like being associated with a particular religion or a particular paycheck is neither here nor there, really.
And this is the beauty of why I love doing this show. This is a hobby of mine, and I get to talk to fascinating people like yourself about things that I think are important that people need to hear about. And this conversation has been amazing. I'm literally on page 2 of my 8 pages of notes. So that's how off tangent I've gone today. So I apologize for that. But back to your book, what inspired you to write this book on Islamophobia?
So the book's got 2 foci. Tackling Islamophobia is one, and tackling Islamic Orthodoxy is another. And Islamophobia, the focus on that aspect of the book was fundamentally in response to a question that back then he was 15 years old, my eldest son, who'd already written a book, and not the dumbest kid on the planet, but he asked me in all sincerity whether Islam was a violent religion. And at first I thought he's obviously trying to just wind me up while I'm watching a Premier League football game. And then I realized that he was being serious, at which point I was like, we have a problem. And I went into my library looking for a source to give to him. And I realized I had nothing which was intellectually dead honest, okay, but was accessible. You had a bunch of propaganda, you had a bunch of academic documents and what have you, which were designed for PhD students, but you had nothing else. And so then I went online and I realized we don't really have material for a relatively young, smart individual who is anti-authoritarian by virtue of Gen Z, who's independent, who has Google and Wikipedia and will always probe and push and question, and yet something which is accessible. And so my job in that sense, in the entire book, is really to bridge academia to the mass audience. I mean, this is one thing that I was most sensitive to, was I cannot be waffling, with generalizations. It's got to be robust material, but it's also got to be readable. And so really the Islamophobia piece was in response to what my son was saying, like, is Islam a violent religion? And I'm realizing that he could not be the only person saying that or asking that question. And then realizing, actually, there's not really sensible, answer which a person can kind of get their hands on and just kind of make sense of. And hence my putting that piece together in the book. Tackling Islamophobia was front and center to it.
So how do you feel members of the community, being both Muslim and non-Muslim, will react to your book?
So the Muslim community been kind of 2 responses. One is, you apostate, you heretic, for questioning orthodoxy. And there's a second response in the Muslim community, which is, thank you for lifting the weight off my shoulders. I knew something was wrong with orthodoxy, and now you've really nailed it for me. So there's been that response. And the non-Muslim community's overwhelming response has been, I'm fascinated that this is Islam in contrast to what I have been reading. And I'm fascinated about the journey, the twists and the turns of the religion, how it changed in different directions at so many different points. That's been a real kind of positive. Like, people have been really kind in that sense. And I think the common theme amongst everybody that I've spoken to is that they've actually enjoyed reading the book. It's like, it hasn't been a bore. It hasn't been too difficult. And yet at the same time, it's been kind of packed with interesting or semi-interesting information.
And again, the title of the book Being Muslim Today, Reclaiming the Faith from Orthodoxy and Islamophobia can be found on any.com.ca booksellers. The holidays are coming. I recommend that for folks. And apologies, you've now met my dog Zeke, who my listeners know. I think the UPS or the Amazon guy is here.
Or maybe he's just objecting to the title of the book.
That could be too. Are there any debates within the Muslim world today regarding the interpretation of Islamic teachings?
Yes, there are, and they're becoming stronger over time. So, and a lot of that has to do with the internet, the explosion of information, the accessibility of information. You've got more and more people challenging bits and pieces at many levels, both academic, policy, as well as individuals, in a way that wasn't the case 30, 40 years ago. You have to understand that certainly when I was young, we had dinosaurs floating around outside, and when we wanted to access knowledge, it was the Encyclopedia Britannica, or it was a ride to the library, which almost definitely didn't have what you needed, or it was an entire project in itself. Today, all of that information at your fingertips, and on top of that, if you can't get the answer or you can't find an answer, you can send out an email to a professor, and if you're lucky, they may respond. If you send 5 emails to 5 different professors, one of them most likely will just, out of the kindness of their heart, give you a response, and then you'll be on your way. And so there really has been that which the current younger generation, I think, has access to. And because of that, there is a lot more vibrancy around religious debate. Having said that, in the Muslim world, in Muslim majority countries, unfortunately, freedom of speech is not a thing. And so any major questioning of orthodoxies in those parts of the world is a recipe for disaster. If you don't want a peaceful life, you start taking an independent view on religion in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, or wherever else. And chances are, if society doesn't make life difficult for you, then the state will. And one of the ironic advantages of being a Muslim of Britain and now living in Canada has been this freedom of speech, this wonderful environment in which to be able to think openly, discuss openly, be creative, get stuff wrong, make a statement and then be corrected without having to face a prison sentence or a mob.
Dr. Saqib Qureshi, thank you so much for being with us today. It was an absolute pleasure, honor. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I have to have you back because, like I said, I've got 6 more pages of notes to go through. And so I really, really enjoyed your vantage point, your conversation. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, Chris. I enjoyed it too. I hope the dog too did as well.
Yeah, it was perfect. And thank you to our audience, which now includes people in over 50 countries, for joining us for another episode of Next Steps Forward. I'm Chris Meek. For more details on upcoming shows and guests, please follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Chris Meek Public Figure and on X at Chris Meek_USA. We'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with another leader from the world of business, politics, public policy, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.